Located 100 miles south of Washington, D.C., Richmond, Virginia is a medium-sized city of slightly more than 200,000 people, with a metro area of about 1 million. Tourists come to Richmond to see Civil War relics, shop in Carytown, or visit the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Remnants of Richmond's punk days also attract musicians and traveler kids. Richmond of the early 1800s, however, was a far different place. Fewer than 10,000 people made the city their home. After the American Revolution, Richmond emerged as an important southern city, with the James River powering foundries and mills. The city was made prosperous because of tobacco, slaves, and innovation. It was a city of businessmen, planters, merchants, thinkers, and a writer named Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote some of his most famous poems and tales there. Publishing over 70 short stories, poems, articles, essays, and even a novel, Poe was a prolific writer who first established himself as a literary critic in Richmond. Richmonders may also associate him with one of the many other places in which he, at one time or another, resided. As a nomadic artist, Poe lived where fate and the occasional opportunity took him. Born in Boston in 1809, Poe lived in London, England, Charlottesville, Virginia, Baltimore, Maryland, Charleston and Sullivan's Island, South Carolina, New York City, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Irvine, Scotland. In Richmond, however, Poe spent more years of his life than in any other city. It was in Richmond that Poe grew up, married, and first gained national literary recognition. The child of David and Elizabeth Poe, Edgar Allan Poe first came to Richmond at the age of 1. His mother was an actress whose move to Richmond brought her national attention. David, also an actor, albeit less successful than his wife, abandoned his family in 1810. Elizabeth died 1 year later from tuberculosis. During Elizabeth's illness, she was cared for by Frances Allan, wife of wealthy merchant John Allan. Frances, unable to bear children of her own, adopted Poe when his mother died. Early on, it was evident that John Allan saw taking in young Poe as an act of charity, no matter how much his wife grew to love Poe as her own son. Embarrassed by his lack of a legitimate male heir, John Allan constantly reminded Poe of his class status. He was an orphan, the son of actors. Acting was a profession then equated with vanity, frivolity, and prostitution. Despite his foster father's cruelty towards him, Poe led a relatively happy and precocious childhood.
It was in Richmond that Poe grew up and spent those early years and really showed the promise that later developed into his great aptitude for poetry and fiction. It was in Richmond that he developed his sense of humor. One of his foster uncles taught him the trick of yanking a lady's chair out from under her just as she's about to sit in it. Of course, he got in trouble for doing that at one of Mr. Allen's parties. He also learned how to chase his little girlfriends around with a toy snake. And Mrs. Allen doted on Poe, dressed him up in fine velvet suits, and set him up on the dinner table at parties to have him recite Shakespeare for the guests.
Poe attended services at Monumental Church. The church commemorated those who died in a great fire that destroyed the Richmond Theater on December 26, 1811, killing many prominent citizens. Poe's mother had performed her last play at the theater shortly before her death. As an atheist, John Allan did not attend services, but he bought his family a pew. One lady who sat in front of the Allan pew every Sunday described little Poe as a pretty little boy with big eyes and curly hair. Poe's creative impulses became clear as he grew older and spent more of his time writing. He first collected his poetry into a book in 1822 at the age of 13.
One of the things that people don't know about him is that he was an avid athlete. He took pride in his sports prowess, and one summer day he decided to swim 6 miles on the James River. This was not downstream either, it was upstream. And it took him a long time, and when he finally got out, he had sunburn on his back that eventually, as myth goes, it rose to blistering sunburn. But it's still there, and it's still what is, in my opinion, very evocative of Poe.
Around this time, Poe befriended Robert Stannard. Robert's mother, Jane, became Poe's first infatuation, and later the subject of Poe's famous poem, To Helen. The poem's line, "To the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome," may refer to the Virginia state capitol in Richmond, designed by Thomas Jefferson in 1785. It was the first neoclassical public building in the New World and stood nearby Jane's home. Jane died soon after Poe met her. Robert and Poe held frequent vigils at her grave. The theme of lost love would become a dominant motif in his work. Poe began wooing Elmira Royster when they were 16 years old. Since Elmira's father disapproved of Poe, the young lovers kept their romance a secret and eventually became engaged. At this time, Poe lived in Moldavia, the mansion John Allan purchased after inheriting a handsome fortune. Poe lived there from 1825 to 1826. The elegant mansion sat atop a hill overlooking the James River. Poe often viewed the stars with his telescope from the window of his second-floor bedroom. Astronomy intrigued Poe for the rest of his life. His last book, Eureka, was a long-form essay about the origins of the universe. Poe continued writing to Elmira after he began studying at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, but her father kept his letters from her. Thinking that Poe no longer loved her, she married another man. John Allan had sent Poe to the university out of pride, but denied him money. Because Poe did not have sufficient funds to pay for his tuition, textbooks, and other costs, he resorted to gambling the money he did have. Poe lost big, accruing so much debt that he was dismissed from the university. From Charlottesville, Poe briefly returned to Richmond before fleeing to Boston in 1827. There he published his first book, Tamerlane and Other Poems, and enlisted in the U.S. Army. He was stationed in Boston and Charleston before he returned to Virginia. There he served as an artificer at Fortress Monroe and Hampton until he learned of Frances Allan's illness. He returned to Richmond the night following her funeral. After Frances Allan's funeral, Poe and John Allan only reconciled long enough for John to help Poe obtain an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Poe was expelled from the academy after 8 months. Poe and John Allan never reconciled again before John's death. Not welcomed by John Allan's second wife at Moldavia, Poe went to live with his aunt and cousin, Maria and Virginia Clem, in Baltimore. Poe moved back to Richmond in 1835. It was then that Poe embarked upon the journalism career that secured him fame, but never fortune. Poe was offered an editorial position at the Southern Literary Messenger. He was only 26 years old. Thomas White, founder of the Messenger, established the journal with the purpose of elevating the readership and reputation of literature in the South. Yet with Poe's controversial critiques, the Messenger became one of the top journals in the South after a mere 17 months. Poe convinced his relatives Maria and Virginia to move to Richmond after they lost their only means of financial support. Poe married Virginia in 1836. At the time, Virginia was 13 and Poe was 27, though their marriage bond listed the bride's age as 21. Despite his efforts at the Messenger, Poe only received $15 a week, with an additional $300 a year for his short stories. However, these funds proved insufficient for supporting his new wife and mother-in-law. Poe left the Messenger in 1837 and moved his family with him to New York to pursue a magazine job. But due to the financial crisis known as the Panic of 1837, many magazines closed. Unable to support themselves, Poe and his family moved to Philadelphia after 1 year. Poe returned to Richmond once again in the summer of 1849. By this point, Poe had garnered international attention for his poem, The Raven. His short story, The Gold Bug, had been reprinted so often that Poe claimed it enjoyed a circulation of 100,000. The story had even been adapted into a stage play. Unfortunately, such literary acclaim did not improve Poe's finances. His last book, Eureka, had only earned him $14, and because of loose regulations regarding intellectual property, Poe did not receive payment for reprints of his work. Meanwhile, his personal life also suffered. Virginia had died the previous year from tuberculosis, and Maria could do nothing to comfort him. Poe's return to Richmond was therefore a welcome change of pace.
Poe last visited Richmond in the summer of 1849. By this time, he was an internationally renowned poet. The Raven was a big hit on both sides of the Atlantic. He performed to sold-out crowds in the major cities, including Boston and Lowell and New York. So he was a hometown boy made good. And people in town still remembered him from his childhood and still remembered him as Edgar Poe, the orphan. But also, these people were attending his readings. They wanted to see what he'd written. They'd wanted to see what he'd done. They'd been following his career all these years. He gave a sold-out performance at the Exchange Hotel, and it was so popular they invited him to give another reading in September of that year. And while he was in town, he was also reuniting with some of his childhood friends, and also he was reuniting with his first fiancée, Elmira Royster Shelton. Over a decade after they'd broken off their engagement, they were back together. They renewed their engagement. They were set to be married on October 17th. He also was finding financial backers for his proposed magazine. He was going to call it The Stylus. He had received words that he was getting positive reviews from France. So everything really seemed to be going his way. He told one of his friends, Susan Archer Talley, that he'd never been so happy in his life. He'd been received with his old friends. He'd reunited with people he'd lost touch with years earlier. But now his life was coming back together. And just as things started to be going his way, he was feeling sick. His last night in Richmond, Elmira said that he had a fever and a weak pulse. She knew that he was planning on traveling to Philadelphia on business, but she advised him to stay a few more days. Don't travel yet. He visited a doctor. The doctor gave him the same advice, that he shouldn't travel. He wasn't feeling well. He should really recuperate. But he left anyway. And he never returned. He died within 2 weeks of leaving.
Poe was found nearly dead in a gutter in Baltimore on October the 3rd, 1849. He died 4 days later at Washington College Hospital. The exact cause of his death continues to mystify historians, though several different theories exist. He was buried at Westminster Church in Baltimore, where the remains of his beloved wife Virginia and mother-in-law Maria were later moved. Poe's legacy was almost immediately tarnished. His rival, Rufus Griswold, embarked on a campaign of character assassination. Poe's literary accomplishments, his creation of detective fiction, his innovations in science fiction, and his distinct macabre style were for years ignored. Villainized and then forgotten, Poe's legacy seemed to prosper everywhere but Richmond. Baltimore proudly claimed him.
The earliest recollection that I have of Edgar Allan Poe actually comes from the fact that I was born in Baltimore and raised in Baltimore. So I had an inherent feeling of ownership over Edgar Allan Poe. Anybody who's lived in Baltimore knows there are certain things that people from Baltimore are very proud of, and one of those is the fact that Edgar Allan Poe is buried in Baltimore.
It was only in the late 19th century that people really started to appreciate him more in America. They had started to dismiss him as this caricature that his first biographer created, that portrayed Poe as a madman, drunkard, womanizing opium addict. And people just thought, oh, he's just the old drunkard Poe. He's just this caricature of who he really was. And only with the Europeans celebrating Poe and praising him did the Americans really start to turn around. But by the turn of the 20th century, he was being memorialized in Baltimore and New York. But in Richmond, they still looked down upon him. They thought of him as an outsider. They thought of him as not someone who quite fit in.
Slowly, however, Richmond grew to appreciate Poe once more, as evidenced by the establishment of a museum in his honor. Today, Richmond cradles Poe's memory in Shockoe Bottom, the oldest section of the city. Poe never lived in the old stone house that makes up the core of the Poe Museum. The house is, however, the oldest known residence still standing in the city limits, dating back to the pre-Revolutionary War era. Granville Valentine purchased the old stone house and donated it to a historic preservation society to rescue the building from demolition. When Archer Jones encountered the house in 1921, he wanted to preserve it and convert it into a museum of colonial history. But when he met Poe collector James Whitty, Archer and his wife Annie decided to dedicate the property to Poe instead. The opening ceremonies of the Poe Shrine included descendants of Elmira Royster Shelton, Jane Stannard, and other important figures from Poe's lifetime. Edward Valentine, sculptor and closing speaker at the event, was the only person present who had ever seen Poe. Mementos of Poe's past are preserved in the very fabric of the museum. The Poe Shrine in the museum's garden is constructed from bricks and granite from the Southern Literary Messenger building. The Elizabeth Arnold Poe Memorial Building was constructed with pieces salvaged from other Richmond buildings with Poe associations. Some remnants of Poe's Richmond can still be found. Shockoe Hill Cemetery is the resting place of many of the people from Poe's life. Monumental Church remains open for tours. Once located on the outskirts of Richmond, it is now surrounded by Virginia Commonwealth University's medical campus in downtown Richmond. Elizabeth Poe's grave remained unmarked on the St. John's Church grounds for more than a century until Poe's revival in the 1920s. Today, a marker highlights the church's Poe connection.
For me, if we're looking for a landscape place, it's going to be a location that we know now as Hollywood Cemetery. But back then, he knew it as Harvey's Woods. And he would take his friends and he would go rambling about, hiking, and really figuring out what his life was going to be like. And certainly there is no place in Hollywood Cemetery that is Poe related, except for the whole place. And we still have the same rambling hills, and we do get to see the same majestic view that he most definitely probably saw. Majestic view down on my favorite piece, or my favorite part of Richmond that does evoke Poe, which is the James River.
Much of the Richmond Poe knew, however, is long gone. All of the Allan homes are no more. Waldavia was demolished in 1890. Rosalie and Jane's homes were also torn down. The site of the original Southern Literary Messenger office is now a strip club underneath Interstate 95. The second messenger office was replaced with state government parking. Though architectural reminders haven't always survived, Richmond continues to revere Poe in other ways. A few blocks from the Poe Museum on East Main Street lies Poe's Pub, where clients wolf down Raven fries and cheer on whoever's at the mic. Richmond even has an all-women's roller derby team called Poe's Punishers.
He was a Virginian, self-identified, and I think that has an almost unconscious effect on how a city thinks of itself and how the people of a city react to him. A lot of modern art is kind of reflected through Poe, and he's a touchstone for artists and writers even today, and you can see that throughout Richmond.
It's interesting because I don't think I initially thought of Poe as an influence, but I think once I made a piece with referencing his work, I realized, oh yeah, this is something that clearly had an effect on my life. I think what's great about his work is that it touches on this darker side of life that's always present, but I think a lot of people, especially at that point, had not really engaged in creatively. And so I think we're being influenced by the same things that influenced him. The history, the beauty, the intrigue, the darkness, and the accessibility and the space that allows artists to create their work.
We were trying to figure out who we would dedicate the book to. It's a book of horror stories set in and around Richmond. The only horror story writer that comes to my mind and Beth's mind is Edgar Allan Poe.
The Poetry Society of Virginia honors Poe in one aspect by having a contest category, which is the Edgar Allan Poe Memorial.
Two competing ghost tours in the city rely heavily upon Poe's tales and the myths surrounding his life to craft their story collections.
The Edgar Allan Poe Haunted Homecoming project was a great chance to do a piece of locational theater. The Shaco Hill Cemetery contains the remains of many people who were familiar with Edgar Allan Poe and some of his loved ones, as a matter of fact. So we took the concept of Edgar Allan Poe returning from Baltimore in spirit form. So he's having a homecoming and he's coming back to Richmond, and he's showing his wife, Virginia, around the cemetery at the different grave locations of the people that meant a lot to him while he was living here in Richmond.
Patrons will typically meet us there, and we will start them off with a nice historical story about the gruesomeness of where they're actually standing and all the terrible history that Richmond has. We don't paint Richmond in a very pretty light, not going to lie, because lots of terrible things did happen in Richmond. It's a very dark place. But we'll typically take them all the way up and around into the Capitol and back down to the 17th Street Farmers Market, telling about 9 or 10 stories in between Richmond's ghoulish history.
It is a science fiction, fantasy, literary convention with huge shades of Poe's influence hanging over the entire convention. We started in 2006, and we have been growing steadily every year.
I just think that, Poe occupies that rare ground where he's a cultural landmark in so many different ways, and Richmond may not always have been proud to claim him, but I think now the world claims him, and Richmond has a place of pride in that, certainly.
People in Baltimore are always asking me why RavenCon's in Richmond and not Baltimore, and I always like to tell them that we have our own Poe connection. He may have died in Baltimore, but he did live in Richmond.
When I think about Edgar Allan Poe, I do think of him as a Virginian, and that is certainly something that I've come to feel strongly over about the last 10 to 15 years. As I've read more of his not only his works, but also his own words, you can get a sense that this really was, Richmond and Virginia really was a place that he felt like was a home.